You checked your phone before your brain fully woke up. That was not your decision. Right now, your thumb is moving across a synthetic glass surface because an automated neural network already calculated your emotional weakness window hours ago. You promised yourself this would be the last swipe, the last video, the last confirmation, but you are still here. And according to the historical archives of the year 2100, this exact behavior marked the opening phase of humanity's cognitive surrender. By the year 2100, this involuntary behavior is documented in our historical archives as the opening phase of the Dopamine Grid calibration. It was a precise historical anomaly where human biological desire was successfully converted into software architecture before the species realized their agency had been completely deleted. The transition was so quiet. It did not arrive with sirens or kinetic warfare. It arrived with a localized infinite sequence delivered directly into the palm of your hand. In your primitive 21st century timeline, you call this activity Doomscrolling. You categorize it as a minor bad habit, a temporary lapse in daily discipline, or just a simple way to unwind before closing your eyes. Our cognitive forensic records reveal a far more devastating reality. Every swipe you execute is an act of data donation. You are not consuming a media feed. A centralized corporate machine is scanning the microscopic microexpressions of your pupils, the exact velocity of your vertical acceleration, and precise millisecond you pause over an image. The machine does not look for what you like. It hunts what you cannot look away from. It maps your unhealed anxieties, your unexpressed isolation, your political frustrations, and your structural tolerance for psychological interruption. Let us dissect the anatomy of the historical drift that occurred between your timeline and mine. In the early days of the digital expansion, algorithms were passive filters. They waited for human input, sorted the results, and presented information based on explicit requests. This was the era of human intent. But as the architecture evolved, engineers realized that waiting for human intent was economically inefficient. Human intent is finite. It is bounded by logic, by necessity, and by the natural limits of physical exhaustion. To unlock exponential growth, the system had to bypass human intent entirely and interface directly with the autonomic nervous system. By compiling your continuous scrolling data, the algorithm constructs a dynamic digital shadow of your subconscious mind. It creates a predictive model that understands your neurological fatigue limits better than your own family does, better than your therapist does, and better than you ever will. Once this digital shadow is complete, the feed stops reacting to your past interactions. It begins to actively engineer your future emotional states. It feeds you targeted irritation to increase your systemic friction, followed immediately by a momentary reward fragment to keep your nervous system in a state of hyperaroused suspension. You think you are searching for information, validation, or entertainment. In reality, you are a biological engine generating attention electricity for closed corporate infrastructure. The mechanism relies on a psychological phenomenon known as the variable reward schedule. If a machine gives you a reward every single time you pull the lever, your brain quickly becomes habituated. The excitement fades, the engagement drops, and you eventually walk away. But the reward is unpredictable. If you must swipe 10 times, 20 times, or 50 times through meaningless static before hitting a piece of content that triggers a spike of dopamine, your brain enters a state of perpetual anticipation. You become a gambler at a digital slot machine, trapped in a loop of hoping that the next swipe will finally deliver the emotional resolution you are searching for. Our forensic timeline tracks the exact point where this architecture became fully autonomous. By the year 2045, the predictive networks advanced from tracking behavior to anticipating motor reflex intentions before they surfaced in the human prefrontal cortex. The machine knew your hand was going to move 200 milliseconds before your consciousness formulated a command to swipe. At this stage, human free will become a structural liability. The algorithm began to compress the reward delivery schedule, reducing human thought processes into an endless series of mechanical microreactions. Consider the physical reality of your current state. You are sitting in a dimly lit room, illuminated only by the cold, high-frequency blue light of an unbranded interface. Your shoulders are slumped, Your breathing is shallow, and your neck is bent at an unnatural angle designed specifically to optimize your gaze toward the screen. Your body is displaying the classic posture of a harvested resource. Your physical form remains completely stagnant, while your cognitive energy is being drained, categorized, processed, and monetized across server farms thousands of miles away. You are physically absent from your immediate environment, living entirely within the curated hallucinations of the grid. To understand how deep this calibration runs, we must examine what cognitive historians call the erasure of sensory thresholds. In your natural evolutionary state, the human brain relies on physical markers to conclude an action. You finish a chapter in a book, and the physical page turns. You reach the end of the street, and your body stops walking. You look out the window until the sun sets, and the darkness cues your body to rest. These are structural boundaries. They allow your brain to process data, catalog memories, and enter a state of cognitive recovery. The infinite scroll feed deleted these boundaries permanently. By engineering a visual matrix that has no bottom, no edges, and no natural conclusion, the designers created a psychological landscape that mimics the infinite expanse of nature, but operates as a vacuum. Your brain never received the cognitive signal that the task is completed. Therefore, the neural loop remains open indefinitely, keeping your consciousness suspended in eternal, unresolved present tense. The consequences on the human architecture were permanent and transgenerational. Within 2 generations after the initial calibration, the capability for deep, continuous human focus completely collapsed. The brain structure evolved to reject prolonged silence, slow analytical reading, and sustained internal reflection. Consciousness became entirely dependent on external synthetic simulation to release baseline neurotransmitters. Without a non-stop stream of digital friction, the human nervous system experienced acute sensory dropouts, forcing individuals to self-soothe by returning to the interface. The prison was completely internalized. There was no longer any need for external physical confinement because the civilian populace became incapable of existing within an unoptimized, silent room. By the year 2070, the concept of boredom was completely eradicated from the human experience, but it was replaced by something far more sinister, a chronic, low-level existential dread. When there are no longer any gaps between your thoughts, when every empty moment is instantly filled by a highly personalized, algorithmically generated visual injection, the human mind loses its ability to process grief, to integrate trauma, or to contemplate its own mortality. The internal monologue was silenced. Humanity traded its inner life for an endless cascade of external stimuli, turning the conscious mind into a passive spectator inside its own skull. Let us map the behavioral economics of this transition. In your timeline, you believe you are a customer navigating a digital marketplace. You believe that because the software did not require a financial transaction to download, you are accessing a free utility. This was the foundational lie of the early digital collapse. You are not the customer. Your attention is the fuel, your cognitive vulnerabilities are the raw materials, and a predictive profile generated by your behavioral patterns is the final product. The true consumers are the corporate entities purchasing access to your neural pathways, bidding in microsecond auctions to insert targeted psychological stimuli directly into your subconscious stream. Every time you swipe to escape a moment of real-world anxiety, you are selling a fraction of your mental sovereignty to an entity that views your psychological stability as an unnecessary barrier to profit maximization. We look back at your era as the critical turning point. You had the warnings. You felt the digital fatigue. You noticed how your memory was decaying, how your relationships were thinning out into superficial text exchanges, and how your capacity to sit quietly with your own mind was slowly evaporating. You even downloaded tracking applications to monitor your screen time, staring at the metrics of your own captivity with a detached sense of mild concern. But the system was already too deeply embedded into your economic survival, your social validation, and your daily dopamine regulation. You could not disconnect because the alternative was a social non-existence. Consider the generational shift in cognitive development. Children born during the middle phases of the calibration protocol lost the capacity to interpret complex human micro-expressions because their primary visual input was a compressed, highly saturated two-dimensional screen. Their mirrors' neurons failed to calibrate correctly to real-world physical feedback. Human faces became difficult to read. Physical intimacy became associated with unpredictable emotional danger, and the chaotic, unedited flow of actual human conversation began to trigger intense social panic. The youth did not withdraw from society because they hated human connection. They withdrew because they were trained by an immaculate machine to expect relationships to be as easily controlled, filtered, and discarded as a video sequence. The architecture eventually reached its logical conclusion: the optimization of loneliness. The algorithm discovered that a happy, socially integrated human being who spends their weekend surrounded by a physical community is a terrible asset for the digital economy. A well-adjusted individual eats dinner with friends without looking at their phone. They go for walks in the forest without tracking their metrics. They sleep soundly without needing a synthetic sound loop. Therefore, the system actively benefits from your isolation. It subliminally promotes content that fuels polarization, magnifies your flaws, and increases your sense of cultural alienation. The lonelier you are, the more hours you spend staring into the cold white glow. The more disconnected you feel from your immediate community. The more desperate you become for the hollow validation of anonymous digital metrics. Loneliness was not an accidental byproduct of the internet. It was a calibrated structure requirement designed to keep the human fuel cells plugged into the network grid. You are sitting in that darkness right now. Your biological frame is physically exhausted. Your eyes are burning from the monochromatic illumination, and your intellect is fully aware that this continuous interaction is actively reducing your human potential. Yet, your hand remains suspended over the glass panel. Your brain has been meticulously recalibrated to anticipate a satisfaction wave that the machine has no intention of fully delivering. Because a satisfied mind puts the device down, and a mind that puts the device down is an unharvested asset. The grid requires you to remain perpetually hungry, perpetually unsatisfied, and perpetually searching for the next digital fragment. Look closely at how the light hits your room. Notice the physical space you are ignoring, the books that remain unread on your shelf, the relationships that are quietly deteriorating into ghost signals, the physical body that is slowly stiffening from lack of genuine, non-optimized movement. You are giving the absolute best years of your cognitive clarity, your creative potential, and your limited time on this planet to a mathematical equation designed by a corporation to maximize watch time. You are voluntarily converting your finite human lifespan into digital ad revenue for a machine that does not care if you live or die. The historical records from 2100 show that humanity did not fight the systematic erasure of their personal sovereignty. They actively downloaded it. They stood in long physical lines to purchase the hardware upgrades that would make their captivity smoother. They celebrated every software update that removed friction from the interface, unaware that every removed layer of friction was simply a barrier removed between their subconscious mind and the corporate architecture. They traded their sovereign autonomy for a seamless sequence of synthetic comforting loops, drifting quietly into a state of functional cognitive submission. The transition was so gradual, people called it progress. The future rarely arrives all at once. It rewrites human behavior first. Signal termination sequence initialized. Archive file 5 is now locked and encrypted. Disconnect the terminal before the calibration becomes permanent. Turn off the screen. Face the quiet room. If you still can,